Good evening and welcome to my special Bibliotherapy Live tonight, which is all about, hold on, it's all about fires in literature. I'm attempting really pathetically to actually light a match, which for some reason isn't working. But it's lovely to see you here this evening, and thank you, pyromaniacs who are joining me. Some of you may be literary pyromaniacs, some of you may be literal pyromaniacs. Let me know which ones you are, and do tell me if you have favourite fiery scenes in literature. I'd love to hear which are your favourite fires in novels. I'm actually being a flame this evening, hence the turban. I'm attempting to embody the flame that we will be talking about this evening. Megan, you're telling me that you're both a pyromaniac, literally and figuratively in novels, in literature, which is great to know. And the Four Zoas is joining us from Instagram and telling me that they were a pyromaniac as a child, but now a literary pyromaniac. I'm glad that it hasn't gone the other way round, which might have happened to some people. So do, if you want to share any of your fiery stories of your own, put them on the Instagram feed or on Facebook, or send me a tweet later. But I'd love to know if you have any great literary fire experiences, or maybe you might be someone who's actually had a traumatic experience in fire, which has made you seek out fires in literature. I'm just going to share with you this lovely drawing of me, which was my Mother's Day card, where I've been depicted as a flame by my daughter Harper. And obviously, I look very much like that here tonight, too. And it's interesting that Harper drew me as a flame, because I clearly do have some aspirations to fires and flames. Now, one thing is, I'm just wondering if anyone is here with me on Facebook, because I'm not seeing people on Facebook. And I'm just wondering if I might have put it on the wrong setting. If anyone is there on Facebook, please send me a little message and let me know, because it's always my fear that I might have pressed the wrong button or similar. So do let me know if you're able, Instagram people, to have a quick look. Tell me if you're seeing anything. So fires in literature are very much part of many great novels. And I bet there's a lot of novels that come immediately to mind when you first think of that idea. Do tell me which ones they are, if you have some. One of the first ones that comes to my mind, and I'm sure many of you here will be the same, is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, in which, I mean, there's even a fire on the cover. So we know that fire is a very important aspect of the novel. And this is a novel in which, at the very beginning of the story, we know that Manderlay, the house that was the essential and wonderful house which Mrs. De Winter lived in, has burnt down. And it isn't till the very end of the novel that we discover why and how that happened. I have talked about Rebecca quite often on these evenings. Thanks, Megan, for letting me know that you can see me on Facebook. Hooray, it's working. Hi, Colleen. Good to know. I love it when the technology all comes together. So Rebecca, I'm not going to talk about in depth, but many of you, I'm sure, have read it. If you haven't, you must. It does have a conflagration, which is very important. And in a way, that conflagration is purging, though it's also tragic. And fire can symbolize many different things in literature, including passion, desire, rebirth, resurrection, eternity, destruction, hope, hell, and purification. I'm going to look at all of those this evening, so I'm going to be racing through them slightly. And there's also an element of fire which is cozy. And when I first put up this idea onto Instagram, I got quite a few people commenting on cozy fiery books. So I'm going to come back to that later, because lots of the other ideas that I'm talking about tonight are more destructive and less warm and friendly. The idea of fire symbolizing passion is one which is very much present in Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, because passion is a deep heart of the novel, with Mr. De Winter's presumed passion for his dead wife, Rebecca, Rebecca's own incredibly passionate existence, and the unnamed narrator and her passion for her current husband, Mr. De Winter, and the passion in all of those aspects in Rebecca is what makes the novel such a profound and moving book. Passion is something which comes into many novels which think about fire. And one of those is also The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, which is a fantastically powerful and strong novel where fire runs through it, partly in the form of Katniss Everdeen and her being symbolized as a flame herself. She becomes a flame as a symbol of freedom, a symbol of eternal hope and eternal optimism in some ways, and also a symbol of defiance against the capital, who are the people oppressing her and her district. Another aspect of fire representing eternity in literature is the phoenix. And the phoenix comes into many fantastic novels, quite often children's literature, not so often adult literature. Lauren, hi, great to see you. Thank you for enjoying my flamey appearance, which is what I am channeling here this evening with my flamey turban, which actually comes from my grandparents' attic, which luckily never was on fire, but was a place a bit like Manderlay in Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So it's all turning in circles here on my head. Anyway, so phoenixes, one of the friendliest and most wonderful phoenixes in literature is the one in Five Children and It by E. Nesbit, which is a fantastic part of a trilogy by E. Nesbit. There's Five Children and It, and then there's The Phoenix and the Carpet. Sorry, I'm being confusing. And The Phoenix and the Carpet is the second of the trilogy. And in the first of the trilogy, the five children have had all sorts of adventures. And in this book, at the beginning, they're missing having a high old time until one rainy day leading up to bonfire night, their children decide to sample some of the fireworks inside their nursery, which results in a completely ruined carpet. Their mother then buys them a Persian rug to replace it. And this, it turns out, is a magic wishing rug which can give the children 3 wishes every day. And not only that, not only can it give them 3 wishes, it also has wrapped up inside it a magical phoenix's egg. And this, of course, hatches into the world's one and only phoenix, who's been waiting for a chance to hatch in somebody's fire. This phoenix speaks in a highly educated, well-bred voice, and it's rather vain and egotistical, but it's a really fantastic character and probably one of the best phoenixes ever in literature. The phoenix in Harry Potter, Fawkes, is also a wonderful character who's also quite haughty. I think it is a characteristic common to the phoenix. If you ever meet one, you'll have to tell me if I'm right. And the children with the phoenix and on their magic carpet then have all kinds of fantastic adventures. They are forced, they force a burglar to milk a cow in their nursery in order to feed 199 cats. They match buried treasure to poor landowners who desperately need the treasure. And they also act as matchmakers between a spinster and a nice unmarried gentleman. So the children have all kinds of lovely adventures with the phoenix and the carpet. And actually, fire is only really a small part of this delightful novel, but it's a novel which, if you haven't read, or if your children haven't read, you should definitely thrust it upon them. So phoenixes are very much related to fire, and they also symbolize rebirth, and they are fantastically important symbols in many excellent fantasy novels. Destruction is, of course, a hugely important aspect of fires in literature, and one of the most famous and brilliant novels about fire is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, which is also, as it happens, one of my favourite novels of all time. And I love Ray Bradbury generally. I'm going to read you the very beginning because that is the section that describes fire and sets the scene for the rest of the novel. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass nozzle in his fists, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. With his symbolic helmet numbered 451 on his stolid head, and his eyes all orange flame with the thought of what came next, he flicked the igniter, and the house jumped up in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky red and yellow and black. He strode in a swarm of fireflies. He wanted above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace, while the flapping pigeon-winged books died on the porch and lawn of the house, while the books went up in sparkling whirls and blew away on a wind and turned dark with burning. Montag grinned the fierce grin of all men singed and driven back by flame. He knew that when he returned to the firehouse, he might wink at himself, a minstrel man, burnt corked in the mirror. Later, going to sleep, he would feel the fiery smile still gripped by his face muscles in the dark. It never went away, that smile. It never ever went away, as long as he remembered. So I'm sure many of you will have already read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and you will know that 451 is the temperature at which books burn. And this book is all about burning books. It's about a totalitarian state where all knowledge is slowly being destroyed. And Montag, the hero of the novel, is a worker whose job it is to destroy books, but he slowly begins to question what he's doing, and he decides that he should rebel against his superiors and find ways of actually preserving knowledge rather than destroying it. It's a very brilliant, highly political book which questions the idea of people living just for the now, living just for the present, which is what does happen to most of the people in the society in which Montag lives. And Montag does actually find a way through, which is really exciting, and it is a brilliant novel to read. And actually, one of the ways that Montag has to embrace keeping knowledge alive is to learn entire novels off by heart so that he can, in a way, become a living novel and he can pass on his knowledge to future generations. And that's something that I'm always suggesting that we ought to do ourselves, is to try and learn long tracts of literature, such as either poetry or even prose, possibly even a whole novel if you can. We should channel our ancestors who were able to learn enormous chunks of prose and literature, and that would be very good for our brains and keep our brains alive and be great to turn to in hours of need. Bradbury is one of my heroes for several reasons, and I'll just tell you a tiny bit about him. He was a great character as well as a great writer. When he was very young, as a child, he often tells of this encounter that he had with a carnival magician called Mr. Electrico, who has the same kind of name that people in Bradbury's novels would have. Wreathed in static electricity, Mr. Electrico touched the young Bradbury on the nose and said, "Live forever." The next day, Bradbury returned to the carnival to ask Mr. Electrico's advice on a magic trick. After Mr. Electrico introduced him to the other performers in the carnival, he told Bradbury that he was a reincarnation of his best friend who died in World War I. Bradbury later wrote, "A few days later, I began to write full time. I have written every single day of my life since that day." It's pretty inspiring. If only we all had a Mr. Electrico in our lives. But the other thing that makes Bradbury brilliant and enviable and admirable and a great role model is that he was quite poor at various points in his life, and he worked in a gas station doing quite a low paid job. And he still dedicatedly wrote every day, and he used to go to his local library and put a dime into the typewriter in that library, and that dime bought him 1 hour of writing time. He would then sit there typing madly for his hour, and that's how he wrote many of his novels, just in 1 hour chunks a day. And then he'd go home to his wife and 3 children. So it's amazing what you can do in 1 hour a day. You can write a book like this. So that's looking at destruction in the form of fires in literature. Another book which does have a hugely important motif of fire in literature is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And I'm sure that's probably one of the books that everyone thinks of too when they think of fires in literature. Jane Eyre was published in 1847, and it was originally published as Jane Eyre, an autobiography, and it is a Bildungsroman telling of the adventures of a young heroine from her childhood to adulthood. And in the book, there are quite a few moments of fieriness which are highly dramatic. And one of them is, well, one of the interesting things is that the two main men in Jane Eyre's life symbolise respectively fire and ice. There's Mr. Rochester, the passionate gentleman that she loves, who's very fiery, and then there's the man that she's meant to marry and feels that she ought to, who's symbolised by ice. And throughout the book, you do see many references to fire and ice, which Bronte brings in. And it's very interesting if you start looking through the text, quite how many references there are. There's two major fires in Jane Eyre. There's one where Mr. Rochester is nearly burnt to death by a mysterious incident in the middle of the night. And then there's the fire at the end of the book, which I won't give spoilers for anyone that hasn't read it yet. But it is a book with big dramas. That's one of the difficulties of talking about fires in literature, is that often, whoops, there goes my flame, often fires in literature come at the end of the book, and they thus have a hugely important hugely important aspect of the drama, which gives away lots of the plot, which I don't want to do. So it can be quite difficult not to give enormous spoilers. And I don't know if this flame is going to keep going on my head. You see, I'm trying to twist it up and it's all going excitingly wrong. That's going to add to the excitement of this evening. Is it looking flamey now or just slightly ridiculous? Well, I'd appreciate your thoughts, but I'm trying to keep it on to be flame-like, and you can tell me what you think. I feel I look slightly like an ice cream. However, I shall continue unperturbed. Um, so I'm going to read you this little section of Jane Eyre. Ah, thanks, the Forzoas, for mentioning the best fires are out of control. That's so true. Definitely the case with my head flame. So here's a little bit from Jane Eyre just to get you into the fiery mood. I tried again to sleep, but my heart beat anxiously. My inward tranquillity was broken. The clock, far down the hall, struck 2. Just then, it seemed my chamber door was touched, as if fingers had swept the panels in groping away along the dark gallery outside. I said, "Who is there?" Nothing answered. I was chilled with fear. Why is it so frequently that fires happen in the middle of the night in books? It does make them all the more exciting. All at once, I remembered that it might be Pilot, who, when the kitchen door chanced to be left open, not unfrequently found his way up to the threshold of Mr. Rochester's chamber. I had seen him lying there myself in the mornings. The idea calmed me somewhat. I lay down. Silence composes the nerves, and as an unbroken hush now reigned again through the whole house, I began to feel the return to slumber. But it was not fated that I should sleep that night. A dream had scarcely approached my ear when it fled, affrighted, scared by a marrow-freezing incident enough. Isn't that a great image? The dream nearly approaching her ear and then fleeing. There was a demoniac laugh, low, suppressed, and deep-uttered, as it seemed at the very keyhole of my chamber door. The head of my bed was near the door, and I thought at first the goblin laughter stood at my bedside, or rather couched by my pillow. But I rose, looked around, and could see nothing, while, as I still gazed, the unnatural sound was reiterated, and I knew it came from behind the panels. My first impulse was to rise and fasten the bolt. My next, again, to cry out, "Who is there?" Was that... something gurgled and moaned. Ere long, steps retreated up the gallery towards the third-story staircase. A door had lately been made to shut in that staircase. I heard it open and close, and all was still. Was that Grace Poole? And is she possessed with a devil? Thought I. Impossible now to remain longer by myself. I must go to Mrs. Fairfax. I hurried on my frock and a shawl. I withdrew the bolt and opened the door with a trembling hand. There was a candle burning just outside, and on the matting in the gallery I was surprised at this circumstance. But still more was I amazed to perceive the air quite dim, as if filled with smoke, and while looking to the right and left, to find whence these blue wreaths issued, I became further aware of a strong smell of burning. Something creaked. It was a door ajar, and that door was Mr. Rochester's, and the smoke rushed in a cloud from thence. I thought no more of Mrs. Fairfax. I thought no more of Grace Poole, or the laugh. In an instant I was within the chamber. Tongues of flame darted round the bed. The curtains were on fire. In the midst of blaze and vapour, Mr. Rochester lay stretched, motionless, in deep sleep. "Wake! Wake!" I cried. I shook him, but he only murmured and turned. The smoke had stupefied him. I rushed to his basin and ewer. Fortunately, one was wide and the other deep, and both were filled with water. I heaved them up, deluged the bed and its occupant, flew back to my own room, brought my own water jug, baptized the couch afresh, and by God's aid succeeded in extinguishing the flames which were devouring it. The hiss of the quenched element, the breakage of a pitcher which I flung from my hand when I'd emptied it, and above all, the splash of the shower bath I'd deliberately, liberally bestowed, roused Mr. Rochester at last. Though it was now dark, I knew he was awake, because I heard him fulminating strange anathemas at finding himself lying in a pool of water. I'd be fulminating strange anathemas, I can tell you that. Is there a flood? He cried. No, sir, I answered, but there has been a fire. Get up, do. You are quenched now. I will fetch you a candle. In the name of all the elves in Christendom, is that Jane Eyre? He demanded. What have you done with me, witch? Sorceress? Who was in the room beside you? Have you plotted to drown me? No, sir, I answered, but there's been a fire. Get up, do. You are quenched now. I will fetch you a candle. In the name... Sorry. There, I'm up now, but at your peril you fetch a candle yet. Wait 2 minutes till I get into some dry garments, if any dry there be. Yes, here is my dressing gown. Now run. I did run. I brought the candle which still remained in the gallery. He took it from my hand, held it up, and surveyed the bed, all blackened and scorched, the sheets drenched and scorched, the carpet round swimming in water. So that is a lovely scene from Jane Eyre, the first major fire in the book. There's many, many fires throughout the book, actually, but that's one of the most exciting and dramatic ones. And the fact that Jane quenches Mr. Rochester's fire is, of course, highly symbolic, because he inappropriately falls in love with her, even as she does with him. And, sorry, just try and sort out this strange flame on my head, which is really beginning to totally fall apart on me. And she actually quenches his flame, not only literally, but metaphorically. So Jane Eyre, that's one of the best fires in literature. There's Daphne du Maurier, which we've already mentioned. And now I'm going to mention a few more fantastic fires in literature. One which was brought to my attention by Trevor Morris is Darkness Visible by William Golding. Thanks, Trevor, for mentioning that, which is the most mysterious of all of Golding's novels. And he famously refused to discuss it during his lifetime, which is pretty interesting. It starts with a fire, and that fire... it begins in the Isle of Dogs during World War II. The streets are aflame following a bombing, and the onlookers are frightened and confused in the chaos. But the brightness of the fire has a curious effect. There's so much light. It was as if everything was seen with too much clarity, too much shameful, inhuman light, where the street ended. And a strange child emerges from that fire and then becomes the hero of the book. That's one definitely to read. And William Golding was clearly very much interested and well nigh obsessed with fire, because in The Lord of the Flies, his most famous novel, there's also a huge and epic conflagration at the end of the book, but fires keep being built during the novel because they represent life, warmth, heat, and hope, and also rescue. And in the fires in Lord of the Flies, they are highly contentious because the two boys who are fighting it out to be the leader of the pack both want their own different things. Ralph is after justice and positivity and looking for rescue, whereas Jack is after fun and living for the moment and hunting. He's all about the bloodlust of the moment. So Lord of the Flies does have epic and fantastic fires all through the book. There is a great scene which I will just read you a tiny snippet of, if I can find Lord of the Flies, which has momentarily disappeared from my fantastically organised desk. Oh, here it is. It was actually sitting right next to me all the time. Uh, at the very end of the book, there's a massive fire, which I'll just read you a tiny section of because I'm very much aware that time's going to run out. There's too many brilliant fires to discuss. Uh, I'll just read you a little bit, which gives a great vision of Ralph hiding from both Jack, his pursuers, and the fire itself. Hide was better than a tree because you had a chance of breaking the line if you were discovered. Hide then. He wondered if a pig would agree and grimaced at nothing. Find the deepest thicket, the darkest hole on the island, and creep in. Now, as he ran, he peered about him. Bars and splashes of sunlight flitted over him, and sweat made glistening streaks on his dirty body. The cries were far now and fainter. At last he found what seemed to him the right place, though the decision was desperate. Here, bushes and a wild tangle of creeper made a mat that kept out all the light of the sun. Beneath it was a space, perhaps a foot high, though it was pierced everywhere by parallel and rising stems. If you wormed into the middle, then you would be 5 yards from the edge and hidden unless the savage chose to lie down and look for you, and even then you'd be in darkness. And the worst happened and he saw you, then you had a chance to burst out at him, fling the whole line out of step, and double back. Cautiously, his stick trailing behind him, Ralph wormed between the rising stems. When he reached the middle of the mat, he lay and listened. The fire was a big one, and the drum roll that he had thought was left so far behind was nearer. Couldn't a fire outrun a galloping horse? He could see the sun-splashed ground over an area of perhaps 50 yards from where he lay, and as he watched, the sunlight in every patch blinked at him. This was so like the curtain that flapped in his brain that for a moment he thought the blinking was inside him. But then the patches blinked more rapidly, dulled and went out, so that he saw that a great heaviness of smoke lay between the island and the sun. I won't continue because it's too much of an exciting scene and I may have to remove my flame because I just feel it's going to keep falling off. I'm also wondering what is going on with Facebook because I'm not seeing anyone on there. I was told, Megan, you mentioned that Facebook was working. But do please reassure me, anyone else, and let me know. And if it's not, then I might have to do something about it. So we have been talking about Lord of the Flies, which is a fantastically dramatic and highly metaphorical book with many fires in it. A more modern and really interesting novel which has fires at its very heart is Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, which was a huge success, being a big hit with many book clubs, and also was then turned into a Netflix series. And in that book, the heroine, Izzy, who is 15, is accused, and we think is also highly likely to have started the fire that burnt her entire family house down. So it's a highly dramatic and exciting book where the little fires everywhere represent everything that Izzy feels is wrong with her family and the ridiculous social mores that they espouse. It's a book which is all about motherhood and different ways of being a mother, and it is a very powerful... Okay, I'm just going to have to lose this, I think, and have the crazy hair. There we go. Let's just have the crazy hair, which is a little bit flame-like anyway, and probably an improvement on the strange fiery scarf. So it's gone a bit flat though. Oh well, I can cope with this. Yes, Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng is a brilliantly metaphorical and interesting novel, which actually really repays going back to. It's one that I read first didn't absolutely fall in love with, I must admit, but then saw the TV series on Netflix and absolutely loved it. It somehow really came to life. I then reread the book, and it was all the more brilliant for having seen the TV series. So I wonder what you think. This is an instance of where people uh, can perhaps watch the TV series before they read the book. But I do think it was particularly great for me to read it, then see it, and then read it again. I wonder if any of you have had similar experiences. Uh, the the book Little Fires Everywhere has many deep complexities within it, all about adoption and being a surrogate mother. And I won't go into these now because they are too complex. But I would highly recommend it as a great book with a very purging and dramatic fire that comes at the very end. So, another book that I really love with a fire at its heart is Silas Marner, which is an absolutely gorgeous and beautiful fable like book, which describes a kind of hermit like figure who is a bachelor. He's a weaver, and he has lived on his own for many years, spurned to some degree by the villagers around him because they all slightly distrust him as being an outsider. But what's lovely about the book is that he has a lovely fire every night where he makes his supper and counts his money because he is obsessed with the gold that he makes through being a weaver, and he makes little piles of his gold next to his fire, and that's his one delight because he is a very, very lonely man. But one day a little girl crawls into his hut because her mother has walked through the snow and is slowly dying in the snow, as it turns out. And she falls asleep in the snow, and her little girl crawls into Silas Marner's hut and appears by his fire. A few weeks before, his gold had been stolen, and Silas Marner is mourning the loss of his gold. Then the little girl appears. She's only a toddler. She's maybe 1.5 or 2 years old, only just learning to walk, and she has beautiful golden curls of her hair. And Silas Marner associates her with the gold. His gold was robbed, and this little girl comes in the gold's place. And this all takes place by the cozy light of his fire. It's a really beautiful, heartwarming book, which is old fashioned, but it is a novella. It's not that long. It's incredibly beautifully written, and it's definitely one which would make you feel the cozy gorgeousness of a fire and all the metaphorical elements that entails. I'll just read you a tiny bit. I would have read you a lovely long passage, but I know that there's several other books I want to mention. So I'm going to read you a little bit. Here we go. Turning towards the hearth where the two logs had fallen apart and sent forth only a red, uncertain glimmer, he seated himself on his fireside chair and was stooping to push his logs together when, to his blurred vision, it seemed as if there were gold on the floor in front of the hearth. Gold! His own gold! Brought back to him as mysteriously as it had been taken away. He felt his heart begin to beat violently, and for a few moments he was unable to stretch out his hand and grasp the restored treasure. The heap of gold seemed to glow and get larger beneath his agitated gaze. He leaned forward at last and stretched forth his hand, But instead of the hard coin with the familiar resisting outline, his fingers encountered soft, warm curls. In utter amazement, Silas fell on his knees and bent his head low to examine the marvel. It was a sleeping child, a round, fair thing with soft yellow rings all over its head. Could this be his little sister, come back to him in a dream? His little sister, whom he'd carried about in his arms for a year before she died, when he was a small boy without shoes or stockings. That was the first thought that darted across Silas's blank wonderment. Was it a dream? He rose to his feet again, pushed his logs together, and throwing on some dried leaves and sticks, raised a flame. But the flame did not disperse his vision. It only lit up more distinctly the little round form of the child and its shabby clothing. It was very much like his little sister. Silas sank into his chair, powerless, under the double presence of an inextricable surprise and a hurrying influx of memories. How and when had the child come in without his knowledge? I won't go on, but it's such a great, gorgeous, lovely book. You must read it. That's Silas Marner, which has a wonderful image of a fire which comes back many times throughout the book, and it's altogether a very cozy book. It's lovely to see lots of people joining here on Instagram. Thank you for coming. I do wonder what's going on with Facebook, but if anyone appears on Facebook, do give me a wave and tell me that you can see and hear me. I would also love to mention, I've still got a few more to come, but some books that were mentioned to me by people when I was asking for recommendations, but which I haven't read yet myself. And one of these was mentioned by the fabulous Book Club Review podcast, who I see is here tonight with us. And the lovely lady behind that podcast is Kate Slotover, who's just done a wonderful podcast all about my book, The Art of Mindful Reading. And her recommendation, which does sound fantastic and which I'm now dying to read, is a book called The Library Book by Susan Orlean, which is a dazzling love letter to a beloved institution, our libraries. And that's a book that I definitely must get. I'll just give you a short synopsis of it. Some of you will know it, and I'm hoping that I will get it, and then I'll give a longer chat about it another time. So this is a book written by Susan Orlean, who moved to Los Angeles and became fascinated by a mysterious local crime that's gone unsolved since it was carried out on the morning of 29th of April 1986, when the Los Angeles Public Library was set fire by persons unknown, ultimately destroying more than 400,000 books, and perhaps even more. And why was this done? Nobody knows. So with her characteristic humour, insight and compassion, Susan Orlean uses this terrible event as a lens through which to tell the story of all our libraries, their history, their meaning and their uncertain future as they adapt and redefine themselves in a digital world. So this is a book that all book lovers are going to absolutely lap up, and it's one that you should definitely read, and I'm definitely going to get hold of myself. I think it's one of those books, from what I gather, that has many fabulous digressions telling you all about many of the books that were destroyed, and also about many of the people that worked in the library too. Another one that was mentioned to me by a regular viewer of these sessions was that was Simon O'Hagan. He mentioned Golden Hill by Francis Spufford, which is a fantastic novel which I have read, and it's one that I had momentarily forgotten about, the fire scene. It's the bonfire night scene, which takes place, I can't remember quite when in the novel, possibly about halfway through. It's a novel that's actually set in New York in 1746, and it's about a young man called Richard Smith who arrives in New York with a cheque for £1,000, which is in those times an enormous sum of money. He puts it in his wallet, and shockingly, within a couple of days, that cheque is actually the wallet, the whole thing is stolen from him, which frankly is a disaster. But the young man, Mr. Smith, does manage rather fantastically to keep going despite having no money. He uses the cheque as a promise, and we then go through all kinds of amazing and brilliant scenes, one of which is this fantastic bonfire, which is a Guy Fawkes Day bonfire celebration, which is attended by our hero, Mr. Swift, in which the effigy, not just of Fawkes, but of the Pope and Bonnie Prince Charlie, is burned. And Smith is completely alarmed by the ferocity of this patriotic display. But the conflagration gives Francis Spufford, the writer, an occasion to offer a nightmare vision of the transitory enchanted moment, like the one in The Great Gatsby, when Nick Carraway imagines man recognizing North America as something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. So it's an amazing moment in the book, which seems to symbolize all of American history, and it's incredibly powerful and awe-inspiring. So that is a fantastic novel with a fantastic fire, which is another great one to read. His new book is called Light Perpetual, and that also begins with a fire. Well, it's a bomb when a German rocket bomb incinerates a South London household goods store, killing 5 people. And Francis Spufford uses that incendiary beginning to create a kind of alternative future, a bit like Kate Atkinson's Life After Life, where those 5 people are given a different future to the one in which they burn, and we see all of the lives that they then go through. That's coming out very soon. I think possibly it might be this month. Francis Spufford's new book is going to be brilliant. Another person that mentioned a great novel that we ought to look at is Rupert Thompson, a wonderful novelist in himself. He mentioned Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a fantastic novel, very much relating to the book Jane Eyre, which we talked about earlier. Many of the events in Wide Sargasso Sea are the same events that happen in Jane Eyre, and there is a fire at the end of Wide Sargasso Sea, where there's also a parrot who is ablaze, which is rather tragic, but it is a very brilliantly written fire scene. Rupert Thompson also mentioned his own book, Dreams of Leaving, which also has a fantastic fire scene in it. So you should read that book because it is a fantastic novel. It's about a fictional village in England called Egypt, which is somewhere in the south of England, a village that nobody has ever left. Peach is the sadistic chief of police who makes sure that nobody leaves. Then one misty morning, a young couple secretly set their baby son Moses afloat on the river in a basket made of rushes. Years later, Moses is living above a nightclub, mixing with drug dealers, thieves, and topless waitresses. He knows nothing about his past, but nonetheless, it's catching up with him. This book is full of terror, magic, and farce, all of which have a part to play in this exciting novel. And there's also a great fire scene. Another one, there's just too many of them to mention, that I really love is We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. Now, I wonder if many of you have read this. It is a young adult novel, but I think it's a superb one for adults to read too, because it is one of those books that you'll read through to the end and immediately want to go right back to the beginning and start again. It tells the story of a girl called Candice who spends every summer on an island, which I think is off the shores of New York. My geography of those parts is always a bit sketchy, sorry about that. But it's a beautiful, idyllic island off the coast of America, somewhere near New York. Could it be the Hamptons? Maybe it could. And it is a book very much capturing teenage life and the feelings that you have as you are growing up, falling in love, fancying the wrong people, getting up to no good, all seemingly innocently. Or is it? We ask ourselves. This is a book which I don't want to give too much away about. I don't want to give you the spoilers because it really is an amazing book which you read through and then actually wonder if you understood at all. And you probably didn't, and you will definitely want to reread it. But it's also one of the books that my teenage daughter read and absolutely loved and kept going back to reread. But it's also a fantastic one to read for adults too, because it does have many surprises, and it also is talking very much about privilege and entitlement. So that's We Were Liars. Another brilliant book that I would like to touch on before we finish is Sarah Moss's Summer Water, which is just out now. And this is a book set on, frankly, a rather depressing loch in Scotland, which is clearly an incredibly beautiful place. But in this book, it's raining constantly. And so it is quite a downer of a book at the beginning, but it becomes incredibly exciting. And Sarah Moss is an amazing person for capturing the nuances between family members and between their different children, the people that are connected with them. It's a novel taking place on the shore of a loch where there's a small group of wooden holiday cabins whose inhabitants are cooped up in the pouring rain that's been falling for days, and which is starting to feel unnatural in its persistence, even for Scotland. The novel begins at dawn and ends in the dark, and from the first page you know that something terrible is going to happen, and I won't reveal what that is. Someone is going to have a disastrous end of the day. There's many different people in the book. There's a young person with a heart condition, an older person who's always driving their shiny boomermobile too fast on the wet roads. There's a strange man lurking in the woods, and there's a boy paddling his kayak too far out onto the cold water. Nobody has a phone signal, and help is very far away. This is a book which does have high drama in it. It's a book that one of those ones that you would pick up and any page that you read is going to be really exciting and full of fantastic language. I really love the way that she writes, the way that she describes people, and the way that she describes the interactions between them and nature. And actually, this is a book where everyone will relate to one of the characters in the novel. It might sound like a bit of a depressing concept, but it really is a fantastic novel. And actually, even though it does end in disaster, and I won't tell you why or what happens, there's something quite purging about it, and it does become, in a weird way, life embracing. Here's to that. Just having my flame coloured drink. So On that reasonably upbeat, fiery note, I will come to an end, although actually I've just spotted one book that I wanted to mention, which is quite a pot boiler of a novel. It's called The Gargoyle by Andrew Davidson. Look at its singed black pages. It is very much about fire in all of its aspects. And it does have some pretty insane ideas in it. It, in some ways, is definitely a lighter kind of read, but it starts off with a really dramatic beginning where there's this ridiculously good looking man who it turns out is a bit of a porn star actor who has a terrible car accident in which he gets completely burnt. He becomes the gargoyle of the title. He becomes hideously defaced and completely changed, and his skin is horribly, horribly burnt, and it's going to take him months and years to recover. He's even hunched. His bones are broken because he gets burnt in a kind of inferno, and it's all about his resurrection after the fire. It is a good read, and I would recommend it as a fast kind of beach read. Not that we're going to beaches at the moment, sadly. Another one which I must quickly mention was recommended to me to talk about this evening by Floss Morris. Thanks for that recommendation, Floss, which is the classic Mr. Tumnus's Fire. Don't know if you can see it there, but look, there's Mr. Tumnus in his cosy little cottage when he's talking to Lucy the first time that she goes into Narnia, and he draws her in from walking in the snow when she's first walked through the wardrobe into Narnia. He draws her into his lovely cosy cottage, and then he tells her all kinds of amazing and fabulous stories. It then becomes apparent that he is trying to sell her to the Snow Queen, but we also know that Mr. Tumnus essentially has a good heart. And that scene at the very beginning of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is a really beautiful, cosy, gorgeous scene, which I'm sure many of you will remember from your childhood. And for many of you, this might be the book that first got you into reading, going through that magical cupboard into a land of the imagination. On that note, I will come to the end of talking about fires, but I'd just like to mention that tomorrow night on Damien Barr's Literary Salon YouTube channel, there is going to be a special event, 8 to 9 p.m, with American architect and designer David Rockwell, who's written a new book. He regularly designs the stage for the Oscars, including this year's, and has done major buildings and theatres. He's also very into stories, theatre and community. So try and catch that tomorrow night. It's free. You just have to go to Damien Barr's Literary Salon YouTube channel. And I will be back next week with another theme. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks to Four Zoas. Thanks Hellsbells Art. Thanks One Louise Anne and Feeling My Shelves, and the many other people that joined this evening. It's really lovely to see you. You can also catch up if you miss my sessions on my YouTube channel. And I've also recently signed up to Coffee, which is a place where you can go. I think it's Ko-fi, Kofi, where you can go and buy me a coffee if you enjoy my sessions. So that's a lovely thing. I think you just have to go to Ko-fi, Elabertu, and that would help to keep me in coffee and books. Thanks so much. Lovely to see you again, and I'll see you next week. Good night.